All right, welcome back to Your Empowered Birth, how to get the birth you want without having to fight, beg, or compromise. And yes, I am actually going to read my entire book, Your Empowered Birth. The reason for that is simple. I want this accessible. I want you to have the 5 pillars of empowered birth. This will change your life. This will transform how you come to your birth. You will no longer crumble under the pressure. You won't give up on your birth. You won't give in to interventions that you don't want, including inductions and C-sections. You won't give in to medical examinations such as the cervical checks, and you're not going to have to worry about feeling like what you want in your birth that you need to lower your expectations. You're also going to have the confidence to step into your power and experience birth in the transformative way that you were meant to. Because you know what? There is a secret about having a beautiful, true, natural birth. And that is the secret that you truly get to tune into your body. You tune into your baby and you birth a version of yourself that is more powerful and more connected to life and to your family and to your children. But birth trauma has a cost as well. If you are traumatized in your birth, it can affect your sex life. It can affect the way you come to your partnership. It affects how you relate to your children. It affects how you look at yourself in the mirror. It affects your confidence in your body's ability to birth. If you get pregnant again, this can trigger even more fears. Birth trauma sucks. And I am on a mission to eradicate it from our society because I don't think that it's right that we are coming to our births and being traumatized. I don't think it's right that we are being robbed of our birth experiences. And so, with Your Empowered Birth and the Empowered Birth movement, what I'm really aiming to do is get this out there to as many people as possible. So I'm going to encourage you, if you are finding value in what I'm sharing, to pass this on to other moms who need it. Because the truth is, I have the book, Your Empowered Birth. You can go and get it off of Amazon. I have it on Kindle and in paperback. If you want to go deeper, I do have an Empowered Birth workshop that teaches at a deeper level what is inside the book, but also the other key component pieces that helped my clients and success stories of those women beforehand who weren't necessarily a client, but they were a friend. The same stories I'm going to be sharing inside of Your Empowered Birth, the same journey that I took to reclaim my power is inside the Empowered Birth Workshop and Your Empowered Birth Academy. So without further ado, though, I'm just going to let you know that today I am sharing chapter 3 of Your Empowered Birth, which is chapter 3, A Harsh Lesson, where I share how I got into this in the first place, what really happened in my first birth that led to me realizing what was really going on and that my voice was needed to be added to the birth work community. Because I'm just going to let you know, I used to be terrified of talking on camera. I never thought that I would ever actually put myself out there. In fact, when I was thinking of writing my first book, I was going to do it under an alias. I was never going to speak in front of a camera. I was never going to put myself out there for other people to judge me. And I've just transformed with the 5 pillars of empowered birth, which you are going to learn about by the end of all of these videos. What really happens is that you transform into a higher level version of yourself, and that inspires your children and your partner to go beyond their own limitations and your friends and family as well. But first, I'm going to tell you that even though you can probably watch this video on its own and you're going to get the gist of the message, I mean, most of the chapters that I share could be seen individually, but they do build on each other. So if you want the whole thing, make sure you go and check out the Your Empowered Birth playlist and go back. If you haven't already watched them, watch the introduction video, chapter 1, natural birth traps, and chapter 2, which is why birth goes wrong, because then you're going to understand at a deeper level what was going on and what traps I might have fallen into, and understanding the other mistakes. There's 7 mistakes that I made in my first birth. even though I happen to be someone who's very well educated, someone who understands psychology, someone who understands how to do research. And I consumed birth for 9 months and I still got tricked out of my beautiful home birth that I wanted with my first baby. So, without further ado, let's go into chapter 3, a harsh lesson. I stared in shock at the 2 pink lines on the pregnancy test in my hands. I hadn't expected this and was hardly prepared for it. My first thought was, oh shit, what now? I had secretly wanted a baby, but I was also absolutely terrified to get pregnant. The thought of leaving my dignity at the door hadn't appealed to me, nor had the reality of becoming a human pincushion with all the blood tests I thought were required. I had only heard horror stories of what pregnancy would be like, and birth was still both a fascination. How could some be orgasmic? And also my greatest nightmare. After getting over the initial shock and telling my partner the news, I started asking my family for help figuring out what to do next. After all, I had never been pregnant before, and I had no idea what to expect. My mother initiated me into this new stage of my life in the way that many women have done for decades. She bought me What to Expect When You're Expecting. That book did very little to calm my anxiety. It listed all the tests I would have to take, all the exams I would endure, and there was very little in the way of instruction for choosing a care provider. My family doctor had recently moved away, and I wasn't comfortable seeing the new male doctor at the practice. So I tried to find a female GP. I was informed by the receptionist that the doctor I had requested was not currently taking new clients, nor was she still attending deliveries, so I was referred to the local maternity clinic. I made an appointment and requested to only see female doctors. This was apparently inconvenient for them because they informed me that they did a rotation and couldn't guarantee that I would only see a female OB, especially when it came to the actual birth. I didn't feel comfortable with this, but I also didn't know I had any other options. The first appointment was very clinical in nature. The OB asked a series of questions about my health, when my last period was, and then informed me, without even asking what my birth plans might be, that the doctors in this practice could do their own epidurals for their clients. Then she handed me a lab requisition form with all the blood tests I was expected to take. At that point, I wanted to speak up and tell her that I don't really like needles and ask if it was truly necessary, but I had also been told in the past by my family and friends that this was one of those things I would have to suck it up for because it was about having a healthy baby now. It didn't feel right to me, but I again had no frame of reference. There was no discussion of informed consent. I had no idea what these tests were for. Only that one blood test I could opt out of was for genetic testing. I naturally chose to have fewer needles and felt no need to do that test in either case. I then had a pap test scheduled with another OB in the practice for my second appointment, and that also wasn't presented as a choice that I could decline. As we left that first appointment, I stared at the piece of paper that I had been handed with my medical information that informed me that my place where I would give birth was our local hospital. I stared at those words and felt knots in my stomach the more I thought about being in the hospital. I didn't want it. There had to be a way out of this. I realized that the more I thought about what I wanted for my birth, the less it felt right to be in the hospital for it. So I started researching how to have a natural birth that was relatively painless. In my search, I found an article on natural birth and the fear, tension, pain connection. I learned that the more afraid I was, the more I would tense up and the more birth would hurt. Since I had zero intention of getting that needle in my spine and an IV in my arm, I knew that being tense and afraid in an environment I was already naturally inclined to feel tense and afraid in would be detrimental to my birth experience. On the other hand, I had learned a little bit about people having their babies at home. And while at the time of first hearing about home birth, I had been skeptical that it could be so pain free, now I wondered if there was something I didn't know. This fear, tension, pain connection might also be the secret to having that amazing orgasmic birth. I started to look into water birth. I like the water. It's always been comforting to me whenever my back hurts or when I have menstrual cramps. I considered that maybe birth in the water might be a good idea for me. And I also knew that the hospital was the very last place I should be giving birth. I knew that to have a home birth, I would need to find a midwife. Fortunately, my stepsister had birthed with midwives a few years previously, so I knew that midwifery was an option in my province, at least in some areas. So I typed midwives and my local city and clicked on the first practice that came up in the search. This was mistake number 1. In hindsight, I should have looked at all the practices, but I didn't know what I didn't know. I thought all midwives practiced the same, and that if I got into one practice, then there wouldn't be any need to call any others. I had no concept of shopping around for a care provider. I had been taught that you just go down a list and whoever takes you is who you get. It certainly doesn't help that our provincial healthcare system is so overwhelmed that not everyone can find a family doctor, and it can take months or even years to find a good fit. I was under the impression that if this midwife would take me, then that was my midwife, because I might not get so lucky if I kept looking. I called that practice, got an appointment, and that was it. I was convinced I was going to be having a home birth, and so I never paid any attention to any of the red flags that this practice might not be the best fit for me. I attended prenatal classes at the health center, taught by a hospital nurse, thinking, none of this applies to me because I'm having a water birth at home. I was the only woman in that class planning a home birth. I was also one of 2 women who had a vaginal birth and the only one who had a physiological birth without any drugs or intervention of any kind. The other vaginal birth was an assisted vaginal birth with an episiotomy and vacuum extraction. That should tell you all you need to know about what kind of birth preparation that class offered and what kind of hospital birth one could expect, even when all the mothers had been planning natural births before going into labor. I spent most of my pregnancy reading up on home birth and all things pertaining to planning a home birth. One thing about me is that when I want to do something, I make sure to research the crap out of that thing and leave no stone unturned and no rabbit hole unexplored. Unfortunately, I wasn't finding the right information, as you'll soon find out. My second mistake was in writing my birth plan. I focused on superfluous details such as the music playlists, the food I wanted to eat, and how I wanted to handle the different stages of labor without actually knowing anything about what labor was truly like. I thought it would be the worst pain ever, but at 25 weeks, I suffered a severe back spasm. My body was prone to these even before I got pregnant, and went to the hospital for a shot of morphine. I learned from that one shot that morphine can keep me out of it for over 24 hours. So that confirmed that I probably shouldn't have drugs during labor, and that not being in the hospital where the drugs were available was the best idea for me. I also felt that because I could handle these back spasms, that labor would be a snap, because at least at the end of the pain, there would be a reward of a baby. My third mistake was that I wasn't getting enough outside influence from family and friends that was positive and encouraging. Instead, I spent a lot of time on Facebook sharing articles on the safety of home birth and trying to prove to them that I could, in fact, handle the pain at home. They remained unconvinced. The parenting forums weren't much better. The natural birth communities were full of people planning unmedicated hospital births, and the home birth moms had already had at least one baby before, so they couldn't be bothered with my first time mom questions. The first time mom groups all repeated the same healthy baby rhetoric, and I just didn't feel like I fit anywhere. No matter how many communities I joined, there was no connection. No moms just like me who wanted to do things 100% their way and who could tell me that I needed to ask more questions, watch out for red flags, and not blindly trust my care provider. No one was talking about informed consent either. In fact, I only learned that I could opt out of certain tests if I had no risk factors, thanks to one of the midwives whom I saw close to 20 weeks. She knew, based on my chart, that I had anxiety around needles. She informed me that the glucose tolerance test I had been dreading was entirely optional. In fact, all tests were optional. I didn't have to do them if I didn't want to. Mistake number 4 was to not further investigate what informed consent actually meant. The lack of understanding of my basic human rights would be my undoing, and also propel me forward into my life's work and ultimate passion. My midwife practice offered free prenatal classes and the option for clients to do drop-in visits during these weekly meetups. I had already enrolled in the typical prenatal classes, which my mother had paid for, but as someone who loves to learn, I felt that the extra classes couldn't hurt. Besides, they were free. So after 28 weeks, instead of scheduling appointments, I attended classes every week and learned all about the physiological labor process, coping methods, interventions, breastfeeding, and postpartum. It was the most intensive birth education I had received so far, and I owe my success with breastfeeding to those classes, as well as my ease in the postpartum period. In both the prenatal classes taught by the nurse and the prenatal classes taught by the doula in my midwife practice, there was a class devoted to interventions in birth. Both times, these classes sent me into an anxiety attack where I had to leave the room and get some fresh air. But in the midwife class, we also learned about brain. If you haven't attended one of my Empowered Birth workshops or done a lot of research into birth and your rights, then you may be unfamiliar with this acronym. BRAIN stands for benefits, risks, alternatives, intuition, and now or nothing. It's a powerful framework for decision making. I wish I had utilized BRAIN more effectively. If I had fully understood it, I might have avoided what came later in my pregnancy. Fortunately, there was someone watching out for me in that practice who ultimately preserved most of what I desired for my birth. Several weeks into the drop-in visits, I met the midwife who changed my life and set me on my path as a birth worker. She was much older than the other midwives I had seen, and I liked her immediately because she reminded me of my dear, sweet Nana. She had a no-nonsense way about her, and she flat out told me that even if I was planning a home birth, I needed to hire a doula. She told me that she advised every mother to hire a doula, especially for a first baby. I told her, embarrassed, that I hadn't thought of it because I couldn't afford one. That didn't matter to her. She told me she would find me a doula. True to her word, she introduced me to one of the doulas at another drop-in class and prenatal checkup, and then that doula put me in touch with my doula. She had agreed to a reduced fee where we only paid her childcare expenses. This was $150 and still a stretch for my partner at the time, but it was still better than the $500 that most doulas were asking for. And I just need to note that this was back in 2012. Doula fees are much higher today, and they are still worth every penny. See the How to Hire a Doula resources for more information on getting a doula and working within your budget constraints. You can find a list of questions to ask before hiring a doula by going to empoweringmomsbirth.com/extras. Okay, back to the story. My midwife then went on her 4-week vacation. And the next week, I met a different midwife, and my prenatal appointments from that point on were no longer as enjoyable as they had been before. It was in my 35th week that things changed all at once. My son had dropped low in my pelvis following a friend's baby shower, where my friend's mother had felt the need to point out how tiny I was compared to her daughter. We were due around the same time, and I suppose it was almost an insult for me to walk in with such a tiny belly, but it wasn't anything I could help. After that party, my belly seemingly shrunk so that I was measuring 2 weeks behind. My new midwife was concerned and sent me for an ultrasound. I tried suggesting that perhaps the fact that my son had dropped might have something to do with my smaller measurements, but she dismissed me as if I couldn't possibly know what I was talking about. I wish to point out at this point in my story that at my 35-week appointment with my daughter nearly 3 years later, I measured small for a second time after she dropped. So I was right in my instincts, but at the time of my first pregnancy, I accepted that my midwife must know more than me because I was a first-time mom and she was the expert. That was mistake number 5. I didn't trust my intuition. I went for the ultrasound that same day and no one said anything that would be concerning, so I didn't worry about it. Nobody called me either. I went on to interview my doula the next night and I liked her, but I was also waiting to hear back from the doula services for low-income families to see about getting a doula who would volunteer her time. In any case, she had asked me to take time to think about it before hiring her, so I had the weekend to decide. It was on Sunday night, as I was watching TV with my partner, that I got the call that sent my dreams crashing down around my feet. It was the midwife who had sent me for the ultrasound. She had received the results and had consulted with an obstetrician on the matter, and they had concluded that my son was not growing as he should be. She threw around the term intrauterine growth restriction, IUGR, and said that because of this finding, I was no longer eligible for a home birth. She told me that I would probably need an induction or even a cesarean. I felt sick to my stomach. I tried my best to hold it together while on the phone with her after she told me that we were to do follow-up testing at the hospital in a few days. But after I ended the call, I burst into tears and sobbed inconsolably. I hired my doula that night because if I had to have a hospital birth, then I needed her there with me. She'd had 6 kids and she had been through an induction before. There was just one problem. She informed me that she would be leaving for vacation with her family the week after my due date, and that her backup doula was also booked. This meant that if I went into labor after my due date, she might not be able to attend my birth. I didn't know that due dates were rarely the date babies actually arrive, and as a first-time mom, I was more likely to birth at 41 weeks or even past that. No one had told me that the average gestation was 41 weeks and 3 days, and so I had assumed that my son would be born at 40 weeks on the day or maybe sooner. The rest of the prenatal visits with this midwife followed a very typical pattern of sucking royally. I had been doing twice weekly non-stress tests at the hospital, and during every test, my baby boy was doing very well. I would ask her at every appointment, "How are the NSTs?" I knew that since there were no issues with the tests, I didn't need to worry about distress. If there was no distress, then I wasn't going to consent to an induction. I would then follow up with questions on whether the bi-weekly ultrasounds were showing any growth. My son was growing, and there were no problems with the cord or placenta from what they could tell, but he was still small for dates. I asked if maybe he just needed time to catch up in growth. She said no. I asked at every damn appointment in the clinic and in the hospital whether I could have a home birth, and she said no. She spent a great deal of effort trying to make me be okay with hospital birth that I started to fall back into an old, harmful habit of people-pleasing. My partner was worried, my family was worried, and the midwife wasn't saying anything that would help me figure out if all this worry was for nothing. all I had was my gut feeling, and I hadn't yet learned how to trust my gut instincts and ignore the rest. Mistake number 6 was not questioning what I was being told. At one particular appointment with my partner present, I said I was okay with a hospital birth if it made him feel more comfortable. That was a lie. I wasn't comfortable with it. I was pretending to be okay, but I was scared out of my mind and had hoped that maybe I could get away with changing my mind the day I went into labor. It didn't help at all that the chauvinist male OB had chosen to use my partner's fear against me to get me to just do what I was told. He even told me, "We could discuss home birth if you make an appointment with my office for a consultation," but my answer will likely still be no. I was luckily strong enough in my dislike of men telling me what to do that I refused to make that appointment. Soon I approached 39 weeks. I had no home birth supplies, and my partner was not likely to change his mind back to home birth. I hadn't spoken to him about my doubts and had assumed he didn't actually want a home birth. And had I spoken to him back then, I might have learned that he actually preferred to stay home, albeit for his own reasons, but it still would have been useful to know. In any case, my midwife, Jules, the one I actually liked, called me up and told me that she had been arguing with the other midwife over my case for weeks and that she was so sorry this had happened while she was on vacation. I was offered my chance to replan my home birth, but I didn't take it. Mistake number 7 was thinking that it was too late to change my mind. You're probably wondering why I didn't jump at the chance to have my home birth, and it is perplexing until you understand the psychology behind my reactions back then. You see, I had just spent 5 weeks with a midwife who didn't believe in my ability to grow a healthy baby. I had spent 5 weeks being told first-time moms often transfer to the hospital anyway as a response to my desire to remain at home. I spent 5 weeks being told that there was a risk that my son wouldn't be able to tolerate labor because he was small for dates and that I should be in the hospital just in case. That midwife was the opposite of Jules. She didn't believe in me. Instead, she encouraged me to just do as I was being told and not question it. My only act of rebellion was not seeing the OB that was overseeing my case as I had been instructed to do. I didn't see the point anyway. Why would I torture myself further when I already knew the answer was no? And I wasn't only hearing no from the midwife and OB, but my own family was also now telling me no. They were relieved that I was going to the hospital after all, just in case something happens. I had all this pressure to conform, and now I had all this doubt in my head that had been placed there through 5 weeks of constantly being told I didn't know what I thought I did about my own body and how my baby was doing, or whether I could actually birth the way I wanted. Essentially, I came to my birth from a place of fear instead of believing in my own power. So I told her that I was going to just go to the hospital, and at 41 weeks, that's what I did. Contractions started the day before, but they were so mild that I ignored them. I had been dealing with false labor the week before my due date and had learned that babies are not all born on their due dates and that the whole idea of a due date was incredibly misleading. I spent much of the day on the computer playing games and ignoring the contractions the whole time. I sat on my yoga ball until about 3 p.m. when I noticed that I could no longer ignore the surges and they were getting very sharp and intense. I called my doula and she talked me through a few of them before deciding to head to the house. I was excited that labor had started a day early because I thought that meant she would be there for the birth after all. My partner arrived home from work and I labored for a few hours and we ordered pizza. At 8 p.m., I thought I could call the midwife and make them come to the house, but was informed by the receptionist at the hospital that wasn't the case. I was told that because I wasn't on the list for home births, that I couldn't be assessed at home and I had to go to the hospital. I did not like this, but accepted it without question, and we went to the hospital when my contractions were more intense. I met a midwife I had never seen before. She was from a different practice and was filling in as the on-call midwife for the night. I was checked for dilation and hated every second of it. And because I had been having non-stress tests, it was also now surprise policy for me to be on the electronic fetal monitor for 20 minutes. Thankfully, I was barely 4 centimeters dilated, and the midwife told me that they could either admit me or I could take a Gravol and Tylenol and go home to sleep until I progressed further. I chose to go home because I didn't really want to be in the hospital any longer than I needed to be. Back at home, I ate a chicken wrap because I didn't feel like having any pizza, and then took my Gravol and went to sleep. I spent the night waking up periodically to shake my leg through a contraction and then fell asleep again. I woke up at 6 a.m. and then labored until 7 a.m. on the toilet. We called my doula to come back. She could only stay with us until 10 a.m., and then she had to leave. I slept between contractions and was half asleep when she said goodbye to me and wished me luck. At around 11 a.m., I went back to the hospital. I didn't want to walk all the way to the maternity unit on the 4th floor, so I asked my partner to find me a wheelchair. He left to get one, and I labored outside the doors of the hospital, leaning against a pillar. Contractions were still very strong, but not as intense as they had been at home. When I got up to triage, the nurse hooked me up to the monitor again. Jules was the midwife on call that day, which was the only good bit of luck I had, because I had overheard one of the nurses commenting to another that if I deliver fast, it will be in triage, because there were no beds available. I don't know if simply being in the hospital slowed my labor or it was hearing these words, but when Jules checked me, I was still only 4 centimeters dilated. But, she said, I was making progress and she would be getting me a room with a tub because she knew I wanted to be in the water. She left to go see to that, and my partner left me to go get our stuff. It was then I heard a nurse say she was here to take the blood samples. I knew she was talking about me, and I panicked. I hoped I was wrong, but then I heard Jules say she put in her chart that she doesn't want that. I thought that would be the end of it, but no. The hospital policy required me to refuse again, even though I had already declined this in a prenatal visit where it was discussed what the hospital policy was and that I had to state in my chart if I didn't want a blood test done. I had done that. I had said no, and this nurse was ignoring my chart. I heard her call my name from outside the curtain. I told her to go away. She would not. She said it was policy and that they needed the samples. I said, no, you don't. I already know my blood type is O positive. So if I need a transfusion, which I likely won't, then just use O positive. I should mention I was talking through contractions. She said it wasn't for my blood type, but to check my hemoglobin. I grew impatient because I didn't care what she wanted my blood for. She was not taking it. I had said no. That should have been the end of it. In that time, I had 2 contractions. It might have been 10 minutes of arguing about whether she was entering my space or not to take my blood. Eventually, I shouted my blood type again, told her I wasn't Rh negative, that I had no diseases, and that I didn't have anemia, and that I was having a contraction, and that I had said no several times, and for her to fuck off and leave me alone. Now, I know it probably wasn't the nicest thing to say, but she wasn't exactly respecting me either. And in that moment, all that mattered to me was that she fully heard what I was saying and went away. She did leave, and I was left to labor alone again as I liked. But then another mother arrived in triage, and her bed was in the curtained area next to mine. So I would have a contraction and vocalize, trying to concentrate, and then she would be screaming too. I had to scream louder because I needed to hear my noises, not hers. It is incredibly distracting to have to listen to other women in labor, and I was thankful that Jules soon came to tell me a room was ready for me. I walked with her down the hall, having contractions one on top of the other, which she later told me, and not realizing that for being only 4 centimeters, that was a very intense labor pattern. I could only focus on getting into the tub to relax because my back hurt badly. I had back labor and didn't know it, but at least this wasn't as bad as my back spasms, so I was coping well. The tub wasn't very deep, but without having experienced a birth pool yet, I had no basis for comparison and thought it was decently sized. Unfortunately, laboring on my hands and knees in the tub wasn't helping with the pain in my back, and I was too aware of the distractions of the hospital environment. I needed to escape, so I asked for the gas. My partner and I had a code word for when I wanted drugs because that way he would really know if I meant it or not. He asked me what the code was and I told him. So for the rest of my labor, I was high on Entonox, which is nitrous oxide, and didn't really care as much that the contractions were coming at all. I felt the surges, but I would breathe deep of the gas and let out the breath and sigh as the contraction reached its peak, so that it felt like a huge release of pressure. I felt all tingly, and I loved that feeling. It was like having an orgasm. At 4 p.m., Jules checked me again, and I was 7 centimeters and barely felt it because of the gas. Then things hit their peak at 8 p.m. when I had 2 minutes of intense contractions that had me scream with the pressure of them. Then nothing happened. I decided to check myself and felt ahead. I thought that I needed to push, so I did. But my son wasn't ready to descend just yet, and all that happened was that the nurse freaked out and said, "She's pushing," and then they pulled me from the tub. I refused to move, so they drained the tub of water and then pulled me out as I was shaking my head no and refusing to let go of the gas mask. They ripped that away too and made me lift my leg and get out of the tub. Each step was painful because I could feel my son's head nestled in my pelvis, and when I lifted my leg, it bumped the bulge of his head. They walked me to the bed, and I was crying and begging to be left alone. I wanted the gas. They promised they would give it back to me. They lied. I had been told that I could birth in any position I liked, but when I tried to lean over the bed and squat down, they said no and made me climb up onto it. I tried to be on my hands and knees, but out of the water, it was so much harder to do that. Nobody was holding me up. They wanted me to lie on the bed. I lay on my side, but I couldn't push effectively in that position, so they put me on my back. The nurse got tired of using the Doppler, so she strapped the monitor on me instead. I kept trying to arch up the bed on the incline to get more upright, but then the nurse had my partner hold my leg up, and I couldn't move anymore. I pushed for 3 hours with Jules telling me that I needed to hold my breath and push, which I had not wanted to do. I had wanted to breathe my baby out like I had read in the homebirth books. And here I was on the bed, on my back, being told what to do. I begged to be given the gas again, but no, they wouldn't let me have it back. I was making little progress, and I was very much aware that my time was running out. 1 hour passed, then 2. Finally, close to the 3-hour mark, I pushed so hard that my waters finally released, and then my son's head was crowning. I thought, I can do this after all. I heard "she's strong" coming from my midwife. I would look up at my partner and hang onto his arms for strength so I could pull myself up a little bit, but I couldn't tell anyone what I needed. I was too focused on beating the clock and avoiding whatever interventions the OBs outside my door were wanting. I don't know how I knew they were there. My mother-in-law confirmed they were, but I just knew that time was almost up. I opened my eyes at one point near the end, and I could feel the ring of fire and the warm compress on my perineum, which actually felt nice. And I knew that if I pushed in that moment, I would tear. There was another woman at the foot of my bed with my midwife. She was waiting for something. I soon found out what it was when I tried to give myself a few minutes to stretch, and Jules informed me that the woman was an OB and she was going to give me an episiotomy if I didn't push now. I was not about to allow myself to be cut, so I did push and I tore a little bit, but it wasn't bad. And then his head came out, and they didn't even wait for me to catch my breath. They just pulled to release his shoulders, which was horrific and traumatizing. And then he was out. I felt relief in that moment that it was over, and he was finally in my arms. He was squirming on my stomach, crying a squawking, angry cry. I felt warm towels around my shoulders, and they felt nice, and I was high on the oxytocin from the birth and had momentarily put the trauma aside. My focus in the next few days was that I had beaten the odds and that I had managed to get the baby out and hadn't needed any stitches. I was asked a few days later when Jules came for a home visit how I felt about my birth. She knew, even if I hadn't figured it out yet, that what I had gone through in the hospital would eventually surface and haunt me. I didn't figure it out until I went to one of the postpartum drop-ins a few weeks later. Jules had set up a birth trauma and breastfeeding support session for after the postpartum drop-in, where we had our well baby checkups. She asked me if I was staying for it, and I told her I didn't think I belonged there. I had no issues with breastfeeding, and I hadn't had a cesarean, so how could I justify being there? That is when Jules told me the most powerful words I have since echoed for every woman who has come to me feeling guilty for being upset about their birth because it could have been worse. If you feel that it was traumatic, then it was. She told me how one of her births had happened within 2 hours of her first contraction, and that while other women told her she was lucky to have such a fast birth, it hadn't felt that way to her. She told me that she had trouble bonding with her baby because of it and had sometimes felt rage as part of postpartum depression, though they didn't call it that back when she had become a mother. I thought of my own feelings towards my son, how I would feel really overwhelmed because he was a high-need baby. It wasn't the same as physical birth trauma or breastfeeding issues, but it was hard, and I did need to talk about it. So I stayed. Listening to the other stories, there was definitely the theme of emergency cesareans after failed inductions, and I felt almost silly to start talking of my own struggles. But then I opened up about how hard everything was and started crying. Instead of telling me to suck it up, as I was used to, I got support from the other moms who had it worse than me. In that moment, I also related how I had desperately wanted a home birth, but was talked into a hospital birth and how much that had affected me. I felt guilty because Jules had done all she could for me in that environment, and likely far more than any other midwife would have dared to do. But my feelings about my birth had nothing to do with not being grateful for the few things I did get from her, and it had nothing to do with how much I loved my baby boy. I realized that day and every day afterwards, as I worked to process what had happened, that birth trauma isn't linked to what happened in birth, but to the environment and the way the mother was supported or not supported in her birth choices. I had not been supported the way I needed to be. My voice was not heard. I had been essentially coerced into birthing in an environment that I had been right in my instincts to stay away from. And for that reason, I still relive those horrors. It was difficult even now, years later, to type this story out again. I did it once before, 3 days after birth, and it had been difficult then too. I had framed it as a story of triumph against all odds, but there was still that underlying trauma that I just wasn't acknowledging yet. It was this birth that set me on the path to becoming a birth advocate and ultimately going on to coach other women how to plan their births and reclaim their power over themselves and their bodies. I started out simply wishing to warn other mothers and bring attention to what the hospital was doing. I was angry at the midwife and OB for making me birth at the hospital when it turns out that my small for dates baby weighed 7 pounds, 13 ounces at birth and was 21 1/4 inches long. It was a sarcastic joke between Jules and me during all follow-up appointments. "Oh, yes, he's so small," we would comment to each other as he was weighed and measured. It took a few months, but eventually I found the information on ultrasounds being notoriously inaccurate at predicting growth and size in the late trimester. And then I became obsessive in planning my next birth. That planning would pay off 3 years later when I first learned from my mistakes and got the birth I had wanted the first time. But of course, that is a story for another chapter. Right now, I want you to really look at the story of my son's birth and see it in a different way. Birth stories, even traumatic ones, teach us so much more than a typical childbirth education can. One of the things I noticed when I was hearing the stories of the women I have connected with since that day in 2013 when my son was born is that certain patterns become visible. It's almost eerie how one can predict with nearly 100% accuracy where the story is going to lead. For one thing, you can start to see where in the story confidence has started to be undermined. You can see how certain words and phrases pop out at you and how they create an image and a feeling that resonates powerfully. If this is your first pregnancy, you might even identify ideas or fears that you are experiencing right now that are very similar to what I described. And if this is your second, third, or even fourth time, then you might see how certain thoughts or feelings led to your own traumatic experience. I am here to tell you, it's not your fault. In fact, this was something I have spent almost a decade learning about. At first, it was for my own healing. I wanted to know why I had been talked out of my home birth and why I hadn't fought harder. Later, I wanted to know how I could avoid it ever happening again. So that is ultimately how I came to spend the first year of my son's life reading everything I could about birth in the system, and I discovered that I wasn't alone. Actually, this had become such an epidemic that there were women out there fighting just to be heard and to give birth with some sense of control over their own bodies. It wasn't long before I learned about Dawn Thompson, who today is a good friend, but back then she was just this amazingly powerful person who I admired and wanted to support. I knew that what she was doing with Improving Birth and now Birthify was needed, and that spurred me to look into rally locations in my area. The problem was, there weren't any. No one had heard of Improving Birth, and much of the information about birth trauma had come from the United States. People here in Canada were blissfully unaware and ignorant of the real problems in our maternity care. So I knew that if I didn't start telling people the truth, well, who would? I set out to do just that when my son was barely 15 months old, and that led to where I am today. You see, it wasn't enough for me to just reclaim my own power and have a do-over home birth. I wanted that for my friends too. I wanted it for every single person who would ever give birth. It wasn't right what was happening. Birth should have been the most important moment of our lives, an initiation into motherhood. I knew that birth was meant to connect us to our bodies and our babies, and that we were meant to witness our own power. But the very system and society that was supposed to help guide us through safely was actually disempowering us. I'd gone into pregnancy thinking that I could do it, only to be told over and over that I knew nothing and that I just had to listen to other people tell me what was best. I had fought against that the whole time, but I hadn't realized just what was happening until it was nearly too late. It haunts me to know that if I had been with a different midwife, or I hadn't had a midwife at all, my birth of my son could have ended in a cesarean. It was that thought that has spurred me to write this book for you, because I want you to know that there is something that you can do to reclaim your power. Whether this is your first baby, or you just don't want to go through another traumatic birth ever again, or you would just like to have more control and reclaim your power in this pregnancy, I have written this for you. What you desire is possible. And as you will discover when you read the next part of this story, it can be the moment when everything changes for you and you are forever transformed into a more powerful version of who you are right now. So now I'm going to show you what happens when you apply this framework and how it led to the most amazing birth experience of my life. And that is the end of chapter 3. The next chapter will be all on reclaiming birth when I used the 5-pillar system to plan the birth of my daughter, get that home birth, and then I've used the same system to help other clients of mine who have had traumatic births to reclaim their power and have that beautiful birth experience. And I just want to remind you that this book does come with bonuses. So make sure you go to empoweringmomsbirth.com/extras, grab the guides that I've included in there because there was so much that I could not fit into your empowered birth without making it a 90,000 word behemoth, which I didn't want to do. I wanted to make this simple. I wanted to make this easy. I wanted to teach you through story. If you are loving this and you do want to support me and you want to support the empowered birth movement and what we are doing, the book is available on Amazon. So just look up Your Empowered Birth. Here is how you spell my name. It's Carly Bonderud. And what you're going to get in this book is really the roadmap to having a true empowered birth experience, reclaiming your power. If you did resonate with any parts of this traumatic birth story, I do invite you to go deeper and go and get those resources, because there is actually a how to heal birth trauma resource guide inside of the extras at empoweringmomsbirth.com/extras. All you have to do to get this package is you put your name and your email in, and that will allow you to get everything that you need to know. It's also going to come with the exercises that are in this book. So even if you don't have a physical copy of Your Empowered Birth, if you are one of those people who prefers to just watch the videos, you will actually get the questions so that you can look through them and do the journal exercises, because part of this book is about taking action. If you are watching this and you're thinking this is really good information and you are taking a bunch of notes, but you do not apply what I teach you inside of Your Empowered Birth and all of my programs, it's not going to work. Because part of what I learned and what had kept me stuck for years inside a toxic, abusive relationship, in not getting the birth that I wanted, in not starting my business right away, not achieving my dreams, was that I would read and I would consume a lot of information, but I wouldn't implement it. And when I had that traumatic birth experience, after having consumed birth for 9 months, reading every single article and every single book I could get my hands on, it was in applying it as a birth advocate, taking what I had already learned, using it in a new way to teach others, that I was able to then be like, oh, I now know how to take action on this. And that is how I created my birth plan. You will hear more about that when I share chapter 4, Reclaiming Birth. And if you are loving these videos, please share, please like, please subscribe, please tell others where to get this information, because I really am committed to having empowered birth out there and accessible for everyone. I'm also going to let you know, if you've been noticing this t-shirt that I've been wearing while reading this book, I'm just going to show you quickly. It says, every birth can and should be a beautiful and empowering experience. Talk to me if this statement is triggering. Jenny, my beautiful partner and best friend, who actually pushed me to get Your Empowered Birth out there into the world, she is the one who designed these t-shirts. So if you want to have a really sassy t-shirt and get the message of empowered birth out there, maybe you are a doula or birth worker yourself, maybe you're just a mom who wants to wear your message on your shirt to invite people to have those conversations with you. Maybe you're starting in the point of like, you know what, I want to advocate, I want to do what you started out doing. Then I'm just going to let you know, go check out Empress Birthworks. I'm going to put the link in the description and you can go and check that out as well. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you next week when I drop another video with chapter 4 of Your Empowered Birth. Bye.